Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Husey, and I'm Director of Strategic Deterrent Studies at the Mitchell Insitute for Aerospace Studies, and I want to welcome you to our Nuclear Deterrent Seminar Series. We have two very distinguished guests this morning, Dr. Matthew Kroenig from the Atlantic Council and Mr. Matthew Costlow of the National Institute of Public Policy. Dr. Kroenig is a professor of government and foreign service at the Georgetown Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. He's also deputy director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. He previously served in the Secretary of Defense Office of Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy and is the author of The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. Mr. Costlow is senior analyst with the National Institute of Public Policy, previously served in the Secretary of Defense Office of Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy, and has just recently finished a report on GBSD and Minuteman III, which I highly recommend. Welcome, both of you gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like you to both first start with a few opening remarks of 10 to 12 minutes or so. And as a note to our audience, feel free to raise your hand using the function on the app or submit a question in the Q&A window during the discussion. And we'll get to your questions in the second half of the hour. Thank you both for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kroenig first for his opening remarks.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Peter. It's really a pleasure to be back speaking at your breakfast series. I've had the honor of speaking here several times over the years. A pleasure to be with the Mitchell Institute and with my colleague, Matt Costlow. So in my opening remarks, I wanted to talk about the important role U.S. nuclear weapons play in international security, the importance of modernization, and then what we might expect to see from the Biden administration's nuclear policy and posture. So the first thing I'd like to say is that I really think U.S. nuclear weapons have been one of the greatest forces for good in the world over the past 75 years. And I think that maybe for obvious reasons, nuclear weapons sometimes have a negative connotation. But if you look at what America's nuclear posture has accomplished, it's really quite remarkable. You know, U.S. nuclear weapons are special in that we don't use our nuclear weapons only to protect ourselves, but really to protect the entire free world, extending nuclear deterrence over 30 formal treaty allies in Europe and Asia and other informal security partners. And over the past 75 years, through extended nuclear deterrence, we've provided geopolitical stability in Europe and Asia, 0 great power wars in 75 years. We've contributed to the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Our allies have been able to forego independent nuclear arsenals because they rely on America's nuclear deterrent. So there's a lot of talk now about the rules-based international system and saving the US-led rules-based international system. And I think that US nuclear weapons are really the bedrock of this rules-based international system. We've created these gardens of peace, prosperity, and freedom in Europe and Asia and North America. And I think it's no coincidence that these are also the regions of the world that are protected by US nuclear weapons. So maintaining a robust US nuclear posture is important. And there has been a bipartisan commitment really for decades to the United States having a strong deterrent force. The major challenge we face now, of course, is that our nuclear weapons are getting old. They were built in at the end of the Cold War. I don't know if any of you drive cars. If so, they probably weren't built in the 1970s and 80s. If they were, they probably don't work very well. And so we need to modernize nuclear weapons for a new era. There is a bipartisan consensus to do that, started by President Obama, continued by President Trump. I hope will be continued by President Biden. We need to modernize all 3 legs of the triad, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the bombers and the submarines. We also need the LRSO, long-range standoff option, and I think the supplemental capabilities called for in the Trump nuclear posture review are also important, especially for escalate to de-escalate type scenarios we could face from Russia, but also due to some of the challenges I think we could see with the growing Chinese threat in the coming years. Now, some people are opposed to modernization or looking for ways to scale back modernization. Can we cut a leg of the triad? Can we delay modernization? Some are saying maybe we should reduce the size of the arsenal. And I think that would be a mistake. Doing any of that, I think, would hurt all four goals of nuclear strategy articulated in the last nuclear posture review. I think it would hurt the U.S. ability to deter nuclear and non-nuclear attacks, hurt the ability for the United States to assure its allies, make it harder for us to achieve our objectives if deterrence fails, and make it harder for us to hedge against an uncertain future. Then continuing with the program of record directly contributes to all the major goals of U.S. nuclear strategy. Cutting or delaying in some ways would undermine that. Moreover, the benefits that people talk about for delaying or reducing modernization plans, the arguments aren't very clear. One of the arguments that's often made is cost, but that doesn't really make much sense. As Ash Carter, Obama's Secretary of Defense, said, nuclear weapons don't actually cost that much. Modernization plans come to something like 5 or 6% of the U.S. Defense Department. Secretary Mattis and others said that nuclear deterrence is the most important mission of the U.S. Department of Defense. And so, is 5 or 6% of the defense budget too much for the most important mission? Reasonable people can disagree, but to me, it sounds like a good bargain. And I have a recent report that I hope to talk about more in Q&A about some of these proposals to reduce the size of the ICBM force. So plans now currently call for 400 new intercontinental ballistic missiles. Some are saying, well, maybe we can go to 300, maybe we can go to 200. And so in my report, I talk about how that would hurt U.S. nuclear strategy. And there's really no benefit very little benefit to doing that. And on the cost equation, point out how little we would save by reducing the size of the ICBM force, and point out somewhat humorously that Americans spend much more on Doritos, Cheetos, and Funyuns every year than we're planning to spend on modernizing ICBM. So, both are important, obviously, but, as Secretary Mattis said, we can afford national survival. Now, some would also say, well, this is inconsistent with U.S. arms control commitments, that we need to be making progress on Article 6 of the NPT. We should keep New START in place. We should pursue trilateral negotiation with China. I think that a lot of that is true. The United States should pursue arms control, but that's not inconsistent with modernizing the triad. And in fact, I think there's essentially the kind of bipartisan centrist consensus that we have strong deterrence and strong forces and strong arms control. And there's nothing inconsistent with that. Modernizing the force doesn't violate NPT, doesn't violate New START. I mean, the biggest obstacle to arms control right now is not U.S. modernization plans, it's whether Russia and China are interested. We see Russia violating other arms control agreements, doesn't seem interested in negotiating a follow-on to New START. And China has never been a formal participant in formal arms control agreements. So that's the real challenge for arms control, not U.S. Plans. So looking forward to what we can expect from the Biden administration, I think my hope is that they will continue with the modernization plans. And I think if you look at Kath Hicks' testimony, for example, she expressed support for the triad and for modernization. She did raise some questions about the timing and the scale of modernization, and so that concerns me somewhat, but I hope that they will continue with the full modernization plans. One of my things that I worry about is reducing reliance on nuclear weapons. In the interim national security strategy guidance released just a few weeks ago, the Biden administration said they want to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons. This is consistent with what the Obama administration said 10 years ago. But of course, the security environment is much different today than it was 10 years ago. There was a plausible case to be made that you could reduce reliance 10 years ago. But now the nuclear threat environment has really deteriorated. Russia, China, North Korea all expanding and modernizing their nuclear forces, relying on nuclear weapons more in their strategy in some ways than they were 10 years ago. And so I don't see how the security environment allows us to reduce the role of U.S. nuclear weapons. And moreover, I'd point out that there's a tension in two of Biden's priorities. He really campaigned on improving America's alliances. He had criticized the Trump administration for being too tough on our allies, said that he was going to restore relations with alliances. And the interim national security strategy said the same thing, that they were going to prioritize strengthening alliances, strengthening the rules-based international order. And so I just like to emphasize that there's a tension here, that U.S. allies are depending on a strong U.S. nuclear arsenal. Certainly the Japanese, the Koreans, Eastern Europeans, countries in the most dangerous security environments are looking closely at U.S. nuclear modernization plans. Are we going to live up to our commitments? Are we going to follow through and be willing to continue to provide them with extended deterrence? And so reducing reliance on nuclear weapons in any kind of dramatic way, I think, then undermines that goal. It weakens America's alliances, weakens our extended deterrence, and weakens, I think, the overall rules-based international system that Biden wants to try to strengthen. Because again, I think U.S. nuclear weapons have really been the underpinning the security of this rules-based system of America's alliances for 70 years. So they said they're going to reduce reliance. I think they'll have to find some way to do that. I hope they do it in a marginal and responsible way that allows the United States to continue to have this robust and modernized nuclear force that is protecting the entire free world in an era where the primary cleavage is really the free world against these nuclear-armed revisionist autocracies. And so we need to keep ourselves safe in this new era of great power competition. So I'll end my remarks there and very much look forward to Q&A and discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Kroenig. And now I'll turn it over to our friend, Matthew Costlow.
Thank you both. Really appreciate the remarks, Dr. Kroenig and Peter. Thank you for hosting these. It's such a great honor to be here and having watched these in the past and gained from all the wisdom that kind of comes through in these remarks. Really happy to have a forum that talks about these issues. I wanted to emphasize a couple things in my remarks here. First is that I think we're in an inflection point right now in U.S. nuclear policy, where it's the combination of a worsening security environment, but it's also combined with the infancy of our nuclear modernization program. So when you think about it, the decisions that the Biden administration and Congress make today in the next couple of years is going to have second and third order effects all the way to 2075 or 2080 in the case of some U.S. nuclear submarines. That's the service life of some of these systems. So anyone who makes, is in a policy-making decision role right now in the US government needs to think very carefully about how their decisions today will affect a future force, a future president about 50 years from now. And I can't emphasize this enough, that China and Russia do not have to worry about the same things that we typically take into account. For instance, the US needs to think about, well, what happens when political control shifts from one political party to the other, right? Republican to Democrat, Democrat to Republican. Putin and Xi Jinping do not have to worry about that. They're set. They are the political powers. Now, thankfully, even with all these shifts in political power between the Republicans and Democrats across multiple threat environments, across multiple administrations, U.S. nuclear policy has really stayed pretty consistent, especially since the Cold War. There's been the drawdown in forces, but basically everyone agreed to that. And Republicans were part of the group that helped emphasize arms control reductions in the early Bush administration, right? So there's been remarkable consistency in a lot of these things. And I think that's contributed to the bipartisan nature. I think there's a fragile bipartisan agreement right now on the need to modernize nuclear weapons. And today I really want to focus on two of the more radical policies, and I call them radical not because they're outside of something I would consider, but they're just radical in that they are outside the bipartisan norm, going all the way back through the Cold War. And so those two are eliminating the U.S. land-based leg of the nuclear triad, the ICBMs, and the second is adopting a no first use policy. So real quick, I have a paper out on this subject, and I'll shamelessly plug it in here. Just because this goes back to something we were talking about, Peter, that General Berg had a paper on the value of land-based ICBMs. It was called America's Nuclear Backbone. That was published by Mitchell Insitute, and that was about 5 years ago, I think. So it's been one of those issues that constantly needs to be re-upped, and there's a whole lot of new young people in Congress and their staffers and in the administration that just aren't familiar with all the traditional roles that ICBMs have played in U.S. defense policy. And so, and I would also second Matt Kroenig's report. Very good. So one of the things I looked at on eliminating ICBMs, and there's about 8 consequences that I found, because I wanted to look at the real world consequences of what would happen if we did actually get rid of our ICBMs. And the first and most important consequence is the number of strategic assets in the United States would shrink from hundreds, because there's about 500 aim points that an adversary has to consider, with 450 silos, 45 launch control centers. That's a whole lot of aim points they have to consider. If you took all of those away, those aim points in the US would shrink to about a handful, right? There would be 2 submarine bases, 3 bomber bases, and a few command and control targets, right? If that were to happen, a limited nuclear attack, we're not talking a massive strike here, a limited attack would significantly and disproportionately affect the US nuclear force, especially if you hit submarines while they're in port, right? But the situation is actually even worse than that, especially with Russia's Caliber sea-launched cruise missile. It can be conventional, and it can hit basically all of those targets. So if you have a conventional attack that can have disproportionate strategic effect, that can make an awful, tempting, darkly tempting is the words I use, target set for a desperate opponent. Why would we give an opponent that sort of tempting target where they can say, hey, I stayed below the nuclear threshold. I only attacked with conventional weapons. And it would put the onus of escalation onto the president. And we simply don't need to do that. Another consequence, real world consequence of eliminating ICBMs is that we would be less resilient in the face of wartime and peacetime attrition. And this isn't talked about a lot, but it really should, I think. You'll remember the B-2 that crashed in Guam a few years ago. Some little technical sensor took down this billion-dollar plane, and it was out. It burned up. And another example I'd like to cite is that in 2012, a shipyard worker lit a fire on a US nuclear-powered submarine because he wanted to go home early. That fire destroyed the submarine, put it out of commission, cost about $450 million. So you can imagine what would happen if the US had eliminated ICBMs, only had SSBNs and bombers. All it takes is a few peacetime accidents like that to completely throw off the US nuclear deterrent, or disable it or significant portions of it for an extended period of time. Again, as the number of strategic assets decreases, their strategic importance increases. So each time there's a hit to resiliency, that is felt all the more. A third consequence is that people rarely, when they talk about savings, if we eliminated part of the US ICBMs or all of them, they rarely account for the increased costs that would result, right? Just like I said, with the strategic importance going up as the number of assets goes down, you're going to want to defend those submarine bases in port, right? Submarines are invulnerable while they're at sea, but while they're in port, they are vulnerable. So if they take on all that more importance without the ICBM leg, you're going to have to invest heavily cruise missile defense, ballistic missile defense, even hypersonic defense, right? And that's just for 2 submarine ports. Now start considering the bombers. As Admiral Richard said about a week ago, he might have to recommend bombers go back on alert if there were no ICBMs. That's a huge increased cost. And it takes down the service life of the bombers themselves. So again, all of these are increased costs that people who advocate for eliminating a leg of the triad never talk about. They don't take that into consideration. And I also wanted to mention a point that the Scowcroft Commission noted back in 1983, where they were talking about the MX missile. One of the things they mentioned is that it's a good line. The Soviets, if the US reduced their ICBMs, the Soviets would increase their anti-submarine warfare capabilities, and their incentive to do so and their possible gains, if successful, would increase, right? So they now have, if you eliminated ICBMs, they would have all the more incentive and all the more to gain from trying to create risk for the additional 2 legs of the triad. So in short, the money you would save by eliminating ICBMs would immediately be spent reinforcing the remaining legs, and you're simply incurring a new cost for no reason. You've lost capability and increased costs. Now, a quick note on life extending Minuteman III, that's become a recent hot topic. Can we life extend a 50-year-old missile one more time? It sounds like a classic rock song or something. Just do it one more time. The CBO, Congressional Budget Office, looked at this, and they said, well, what would happen if we life extended Minuteman III one more time, push back GBSD 20 years? What would happen? Well, they mostly found that all the costs would simply be shifted to the right. Whatever you would save is about 18 billion over 30 years. Now, let me put that 18 billion, which sounds like a big number, into context. Over 30 years, that is less than 1/1000th of 1% over those 30 years of the US defense budget. Less than 1/1000th of a percent. Stated differently, 18 billion over 30 years averages about 600 million a year. 600 million is less than 1/10 of 1% of the annual defense budget. If that's the savings you are looking for, you're actually going to take on increased risk because you are now adding a patchwork of upgrades onto an old missile that you are going to want to test all those upgrades to a slept Minuteman III, right? Well, you can't increase the number of tests because then you run out of the missile bodies themselves, and you start eating into the actual deployed nuclear force numbers. So all of this adds up to penny wise and pound foolish. It's unnecessary, and at the end of the day, you get a less capable missile. I'm running a little long because I get fired up about this Minuteman III stuff, but I'll just make a quick note on no first use. I expect to complete my study of no first use in a month or so, but I wanted to share some preliminary findings. I think the bottom line is that nuclear no first use pledges fail according to the standards set by those who promote them. For example, those who support no first use claim that potential adversaries will take note of our no first use pledge and act in more stabilizing ways during a crisis. But if one really looks at the historical research in this, only 3 states in the last 40 years have issued a no first use pledge. Soviet Union, China, and India. And none, I repeat, none of the states that those no first use pledges were aimed at believed that. We did not believe the Soviet Union when they pledged nuclear no first use. We did not and do not believe China when they pledged nuclear no first use. And Pakistan does not believe India when they proposed their nuclear no first use. If the whole point is to get crisis stability, no first use is not the way to do it. And the last thing I'll say on this is no first use is kind of the worst kind of policy because it's one that adversaries don't believe, but your allies do believe. And that just only increases the risk of nuclear proliferation. If your allies believe there is an actual threat that could require US nuclear first use, and the US preemptively takes that off the table, that's a security risk to them. And it's simply unnecessary. So in my estimation, there's little to be gained, much could be lost from adopting a nuclear no first use policy. And if the Biden administration means what it says about shoring up alliances, it will steer clear from eliminating ICBMs and adopting a no first use policy. And that's it.
Thank you very much, both Dr. Kroenig and Mr. Costlow for extraordinary presentations. I would like to go to a question to Matt Kroenig first. In your March article, The Downsides of Downsizing, Why the US Needs 400 ICBMs, you discussed the debate between fielding 400 Minuteman, or now GBSD is the plan, and some people have suggested 300. Some have suggested less, but we'll go to 300. Can you talk to us about what impact that 100 has on both our adversaries and how they look at deterrence and our allies?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And I did post this piece in the chat for those who are interested in reading it. But what I do is start with the 4 goals of US nuclear strategy as articulated in the last nuclear posture review. We want to deter nuclear and non-nuclear attack, assure allies, achieve our objectives if deterrence fails, and hedge against an uncertain future. And I point out how going from 400 to 300 would weaken all of those goals. So when it comes to deterrence, reducing the size of the ICBM force would put a disarming strike, could make it more attractive to Russia, could one day put it within reach of China as China expands the size of its arsenal. And then I also worry about how that would play in brinkmanship settings. I think having a robust arsenal has strengthened US resolve to extend deterrence in the past. I think adversaries might be more willing to initiate and escalate challenges against the United States and our allies if we weaken our deterrent. In terms of assurance, it's been a difficult decade or so for US allies. Many of them question whether the United States is still willing to provide extended deterrence after what they saw as maybe a US withdrawal from the world in the Obama and the Trump administrations. And so I think failing to follow through on modernization plans that they're counting on for their security would contribute to those fears that the United States isn't really serious anymore about extended deterrence. And that's not just a theoretical argument. I've had colleagues in Japan, South Korea, and Poland tell me that directly, that they're watching US modernization and they would see scaling back of the program of record as a sign that the United States might not be serious about this anymore. Achieve our objectives if deterrence fails. We don't like to think about this, but the enemy gets a vote. Russia and China could decide to attack the United States. If we reduce the size of our arsenal, that means those are nuclear weapons that Russia and China don't need to worry about, could free up Russian and Chinese nuclear weapons to do other things, including attack U.S. cities and kill millions of more Americans than would need to die. And finally, hedge against an uncertain future as Russia builds new nuclear weapons that are not compliant with New START. China expands the size of its arsenal. It's possible that there will be upward pressure on the size of the deployed strategic U.S. arsenal. If we wanted to increase the size of our arsenal, one of the easier ways to do that would be to upload ICBMs. But as we reduce the size, then that reduces our upload capacity. So for all the four most important goals of U.S. nuclear strategy, reducing the size of the ICBM force hinders those goals.
I'd like to turn it over to Matt Costlow. Would you also comment, because you've addressed this issue in your recent study, about the size and capability of the ICBM force affects the calculus of our adversaries, but how does it affect our allies? And perhaps you could piggyback on Dr. Kroenig's remarks.
Sure, I think he hit a lot of the main points. I would also point out that Japan, when we released the 2018 NPR, Japan's foreign minister came out with a very nice statement saying, "Hey, this is exactly what we liked." It recognizes the security environment for what it is, and it has prudent options to respond to it. I would also note the 2018 Brussels summit declaration in NATO. They specifically call out, I think their words are, especially the American forces, as being important to NATO's nuclear alliance. Now, they don't call out ICBMs specifically, but they also don't say they're not important. And I think when you talk with a lot of these allied delegations that are always coming through the Pentagon, it would be hard to overestimate the effect that dramatically cutting an entire leg of the nuclear triad would have on their security calculus. They're already a little on edge, just simply because of their neighbors and simply because of some of the mixed signals they see coming out of Washington. And something that is practically irreversible, such as getting rid of ICBMs. Now, technically, you can get it back, but as we see with GBSD, it's going to take a long time. And we're working with systems that are already in place. So once you get rid of it, it's basically gone for probably 20 years. That would be, no matter how well we pre-brief our allies on a move such as that, it would be a huge shock. And I think it opens up questions, legitimate questions about, can the US effectively stop nuclear-backed coercion? Because one of the things that would happen is if you got rid of ICBMs or significantly degraded them, more countries would be able to effectively coerce the US homeland with their nuclear weapons. Suddenly, North Korea, if they advance enough in their ballistic missile countermeasures, would be able to threaten significant parts of the US nuclear deterrent. That's an earthquake-sized shift in the possibilities and the dangers for our allies.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, for that. I want to follow up with you. You have a recent publication called Reducing U.S. Reliance on Nuclear Weapons While Others Do Not. And you brought up an interesting conundrum that your boss, Keith Payne, also raised, and that is, if the United States goes heavy conventional capability with some missile defenses, but neglects the extended regional, for example, in NATO and the Western Pacific, extended deterrence, does that not push our adversaries who may feel they're losing a conventional fight to go quickly to the nuclear level and escalate to there where they think they have an advantage? Could you address this issue of whether, if the US reduces our reliance on nuclear weapons for deterrence, how are our adversaries most likely to react, particularly situation where conventionally they may be losing?
Sure, and it's an interesting conundrum that people rarely talk about. And one of the things you can see from the North Korean nuclear arsenal, I think, very clearly is they're responding to our conventional superiority. They know that they cannot win a conventional fight. And that's one of the reasons why they really like nuclear weapons, and they're not likely to give them up. Something they've always said is, look what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, right? He did not have nuclear weapons and he was able to be taken out. Same with Saddam Hussein. So they always point to these instances where for dictator autocracies, they can have strong armies, but they know they can never match the US. So with that publication you were addressing, I was trying to tease out, how did the Obama administration say they were going to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons? How did they do so in actuality? And there were essentially three things that they did. One was boost conventional, especially long range precision fire missiles. And another was increasing missile defense, and specifically the regional missile defense. And so it's true, if you do those things on the margins, I think you can reduce reliance on nuclear weapons to some extent. The question is that wise? And how far do you go? Now, that's all subjective, because Russia always says, and I think with some sincerity, that they truly fear kind of a conventional prompt global strike, purely conventional strategic level capability that we can take out a lot of their strategic assets without actually going nuclear. It's one of those things where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? And I don't know that there's a good answer. I think one of the best ways we can think about it, though, is if we protect ourselves at the strategic level with flexible and adaptable options, we can strengthen deterrence at the conventional level as well. And the best thing for everyone involved would be to avoid a fight, to just be deterred. And a stronger conventional force, when linked with a flexible, multiple option nuclear force, is probably the best strategy to get there.
Thank you very much for that. Let me go on to Dr. Kroenig. You've explained the other side of this discussion, and that is reducing nuclear weapons or nuclear forces, getting rid of the ICBM leg, the long-range strike option, or two that are mentioned. Global Zero suggests we go to 6 submarines as opposed to 12. How will that affect our allies' perception of the United States? And in particular, how would it affect our allies and partners in terms of their sense of not only our extended deterrent, but their sense of maybe they should think seriously about developing their own nuclear capability?
Yes, well, to reinforce some of the themes in my opening remarks, U.S. nuclear weapons are special, and I think we don't recognize that enough. We kind of compare U.S. and Russian force sizes and other things, but our nuclear weapons are special. Russia, China, other countries are looking to advance their own interests only with their nuclear weapons. The United States is really trying to defend the entire free world. Over 30 other democracies depend on U.S. nuclear weapons for their security. And so we're building a force not just for us, but to protect the entire free world. And so they're watching what we do closely. When we've retired systems in the past, like the TLAM-N, our allies were concerned about that. I've talked to Japanese officials who are worried about us retiring the TLAM-N, who have experts who have said that they're happy to see the new low-yield submarine launch cruise missile come back. And so if we were to kill that program, certainly if we were to cut into the triad, I think they would view that with concern. International relations scholars discuss credibility in international politics. It's easy to say, have cheap talk, say that you'll deter adversaries, say that you'll assure allies, but what really counts are the costly signals. In everyday life, what we say, do you put your money where your mouth is? well, this is our opportunity to put our money where our mouth is. We say this force is to defend the entire free world. Are we really building a force to do that? And so I think continuing with the modernization plans is important. As we mentioned earlier, the allies are already somewhat concerned that maybe America is pulling back from the world. It seems like there's this isolationist sentiment. What's really going on in Washington? Scaling back nuclear plans that we put in place in 2010, when there wasn't much of a threatening security environment, and saying we're going to do less than that in this security environment, I think would be read by both adversaries and allies that we may not be as ambitious with our nuclear strategy as we've been in the past. Maybe we're pulling back from extended deterrence. Maybe we're just interested in protecting ourselves and leaving our allies to fend for themselves, in which case I think they would start to think more seriously about independent nuclear arsenals. And in the past few years, you've seen a revival of a debate in the expert community in some countries where those debates had long been put to rest. I've talked to German experts, for example, who have said maybe Germany should build nuclear weapons. So this robust deterrent has kept a lid on allied nuclear proliferation for many decades. And I don't think we want to take that lid off and release potentially proliferation among friends and allies and partners.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to combine a couple questions. Some of you have already addressed the question of where the Biden administration may be going, but I'm going to talk about the development in Russia of nuclear forces that are not part of the START agreement, not contained by that. They're often called exotic or new means of delivery, both outside the treaty as well as new types. I'd like both of you to address how that affects us, but more in particular, the Strat Commander, Admiral Richard, has particularly emphasized the Chinese growth, saying that it's not going to double in a decade. He thinks it's going to double in 5 years and then maybe redouble again. And there's a new article by Mark Schneider of NIPP today about this. And someone said that the only people who know what China has in terms of nuclear weapons are the Chinese, but they're not telling anybody. But at least we are looking at what they put at sea in terms of subs, the new mobile and land-based ICBMs and bombers. So I'll start with you, Matt Costlow. Tell us what in particular strikes you about the outside the New START treaty, Russian developments and the Chinese developments as a whole, how that affects us, because we have a couple more minutes before we go to questions from the audience.
Sure. And I think one of the most striking things about the novel Russian systems and the growth in Chinese nuclear systems, the two actually have a common factor, and that's they should never have happened if those who promote nuclear cuts were right. Okay, so we restrained ourselves for the past 20 some years, right? We've come down from Cold War highs. We've lowered our reliance on nuclear weapons. We've entered treaty after treaty in arms control. All of those things, if proponents of nuclear cuts were correct, should have led to restraint from the Russians and the Chinese, but they didn't. And that's because there is a linkage between what the US does and what they do, but it's not this mechanical action reaction arms race dynamic that they always say there is. I think it was Colin Gray who used to say that arms control treaties simply drive competition to other parts that are not included in the treaties. And that's what you see with the Russian novel nuclear systems. They are not covered under the treaty, and they knew that, and they simply dusted off old Soviet designs and put new Russian parts on them. And if Status 6 and this flying nuclear Chernobyl comes to pass, I'm not particularly worried about it. I'm more, I think it's a fine cost imposition that they're imposing on themselves. They've killed 7 of their best scientists trying to make this silly Chernobyl flying cruise missile. So I'm not too worried about that, but I think it is indicative of the fallacy of this kind of action-reaction arms race. As for China, it's basically becoming the defining issue of the nuclear field, I think. Lots of people dismissed the Trump administration when they said that China will at least double. At first they said double, and then they said at least double. And now Admiral Richard has said triple or quadruple, right? And now we have Biden administration officials confirming this in open testimony. They say at least a double. So I think Admiral Richards has it right when he says, look, this is going to be additive to what we are currently planning. Now, there's a very good debate to be had about how much more we may need to deter China and when and for what scenarios. All of that needs to be hashed out still. But yeah, it is the defining issue for increasingly assertive China with a larger arsenal, and it's going to affect our allies first and then us.
Thank you. Dr. Kroenig, would you like to comment?
Yes, beginning with Russia, and I did publish a report about a year ago on Russia's exotic nuclear weapons, and so I posted that in the chat for people who are interested. So I think what Russia's trying to do is to gain an advantage within New START. So they're locking us in with the strategic deployed warheads that are controlled by New START, and then at the high end, they're building these new exotic nuclear weapons that you mentioned. But at the low end, they have this long-standing advantage in non-strategic nuclear weapons, and they're also modernizing there. And so, you know, they have a quantitative nuclear advantage over the United States with New START. And so there's been a long-standing bipartisan concern with the non-strategic weapons. I think there's concern now with the exotic nuclear weapons. So the Trump administration's approach was to make New START extension contingent on a commitment to get those non-strategic nuclear weapons under control. I think that was the right approach. The Biden administration has decided that they've gone ahead and extended New START, and then they'll try to use the next several years to have a bigger negotiation to control those other systems. I hope they're able to do that, but I'm skeptical. I don't see Russia's incentive to agree to these limits. But I think there is agreement. We do need to get limits on these if arms control with Russia is going to make sense for U.S. interest. On China, I am concerned about the Chinese nuclear buildup. I'm doing some research on this now. You know, a couple of years ago, I had a report where I said of the three nuclear challenges the United States faces, three principal nuclear armed rivals, Russia, China, and North Korea, I thought China was the least concerning. Just a few years ago, I thought Russia escalate to de-escalate. Some of the crises with North Korea were most concerning. I think I've changed my mind on that. I am really worried about what this buildup means about Chinese intentions and for U.S. strategy. And the question Admiral Richards raised in his testimony recently, how do you think about deterring Russia and China at the same time? And so I haven't seen Mark's report on this, but glad that he's done something. I look forward to reading that. I think we do need to think hard about this. For a long time, China's nuclear forces were kind of a lesser included case once we've dealt with Russia. But if China is building more of a superpower arsenal, then I think that is challenging. And one immediate implication is I think it puts upward pressure on the size of the US force. If we need to deter Russia and China at the same time, I think we might be in a place very soon where we might decide 1550 is no longer enough. We need to think about going back up. So this is an area where I want to continue to think, and I'll be sure to read Mark's new report.
Well, we have about 10 minutes or so left. I'd like to go through the questions that we've gotten. One, Matthew, Dr. Kroenig, would you make available to us your CBO report that you mentioned? I'd like to send that to Ted Hildreth, who was one of our people online who asked for that report. A couple questions. One from Patty Geller from the Heritage Foundation. Is there a distinction between no first use and minimal use? Are they connected in terms of a strategy? Because you could adopt no first use, but you could also say we're going to have sole use and define that in some way. So are they contradictory or are they complementary? And I'll try to keep my questions short, but this is kind of a quick round. So let's keep our answers short so I can get to the rest of the questions. And Matt Costlow, why don't you answer that first? Because you've done some work on this.
Sure, yeah. So there's been some recent discussion about whether sole purpose or no first use are the same or different. And I tend to think of it as a distinction without a difference. If the sole purpose of your U.S. nuclear arsenal is only to deter, then you would never use a nuclear weapon first, right? But I think the idea of a sole purpose statement while refraining from a no first use policy, it just doesn't work. It's a rhetorical sleight of hand. I think they have equal bad connotations, especially for our allies, and a sole purpose is silly for another reason, because if it's only for deterrence, your nuclear arsenal is only for deterrence, and an adversary like Russia uses a nuclear weapon in a limited sense, well, according to your declaratory policy, you're still not allowed to use anything back because they're only for deterrence. And they're not for achieving objectives if deterrence fails. So I disagree that there's any real distinction between the two.
Let me, if I could go to the next question, which is some comments that the participants have made. One, Jim Miller says, if you remember, that the bomber costs in terms of nuclear are 3% of the total. And one of our participants asked, could you reduce the bomber leg of the triad to pay for ICBMs? Number one. Number two, is it not true that the new ICBM has very low sustainment costs, at least that's what's projected, versus Minuteman? So Matthew Kroenig and Matt Costlow, could you briefly address those two issues? Could you reduce your bomber leg and pay for some ICBMs? And with the new ICBMs, don't you have a benefit, lower sustainment costs?
So for the first question, can we cut the bomber leg if we need ICBMs? I guess the first thing I would do is challenge the premise and why this constant search to get rid of a leg of the triad. There are very few things where there's been a bipartisan consensus for over a half century. There's been a bipartisan consensus for over a half century that we need all legs of the triad. Even officials who've come into office skeptical about all legs, including Secretary Mattis, look at it hard and say, no, we need all three legs. So I think we need all three legs. I don't know why we're trying to cut a leg. This is important. We're talking about deterring strategic attack on the United States and its allies. So no, I don't think we can cut the bomber leg. And even if we got rid of nuclear weapons tomorrow, we would need the bombers for conventional missions. So we need all three legs. On sustainment, yes. That's one of the problems with Minuteman III is they're so old that we're spending a lot on maintenance of these old systems. And the people I've had the privilege to visit some of the bases, and they're doing a remarkable job. But I sometimes get the feeling that there are more mechanics on base than pilots or other things, because that's a large part of maintaining ICBMs at this point, is keeping them up to date. And so, going to the cost issue, I've actually seen some estimates that show that GBSD is cheaper than continuing with ICBMs because the maintenance costs are so much cheaper.
Yes,
so that is a major benefit, yes.
Okay.
And I would note a data point that I have in my new report, wink, right? It's a quote from General Timothy Ray, who I believe is head of Air Force Global Strike Command. And the things they're hearing is that because of the modular way that this GBSD is going to be built, it could mean a 2/3 reduction in the number of times they have to open the launcher closure door, which means they have a security team, lined up. That's a whole bunch of personnel to keep the missile itself safe. So a 2/3 reduction in those, and a 2/3 reduction in the number of times they may need to actually open up the missile itself. So there's going to be a whole bunch of reductions, I think, in some of the most costly areas of the program. Now, everyone should remember that ICBMs are the cheapest of the three legs of the nuclear triad to maintain and operate and modernize. cheapest across the board on all of those. And so I think what they're building into this system is probably going to do a good job of keeping the costs low, because operations and maintenance is one of the biggest cost drivers of a program across its service life.
Exactly right. General Ray said that at our symposium in December that we did with Global Strike Command. And the number he used, it was a 70% cut in the number of personnel and security requirement, because you can repair the missile GBSD inside the silo without opening the door. It's pretty extraordinary. We have three other questions. They're all related, and they relate to NATO in particular and then Pacific. But in NATO, what's the prospects of it continuing as a nuclear alliance, which it is? And should we put more tactical nuclear weapons in Europe as part of NATO to defend and deter the Russians, which have a big advantage there? And the second part of the question we had people asking is, particularly in Pacific, what about enhancing the ballistic missile defense capability we have there as well? And then we have one other question from Dan Miller, which I'd like to call on as soon as we finish the answer to these questions. Go ahead, Matt Kroenig.
Okay, well, I can take the NATO Europe one if Matt wants to do Asia, because I see we're running short. I think the Russia escalate to de-escalate challenge is a real one. I think Russia's advantage in non-strategic weapons is a real problem. I think we've made progress on dealing with this. The 2018 Nuclear Posture Review addressed this problem, talked about how the United States can respond with limited strikes to Russian escalate to de-escalate strikes as a deterrent, and announced these two supplemental capabilities to deal specifically with this challenge. So I think those were a step in the right direction. And I think it would be a mistake if we were to cut those planned capabilities. On NATO as a nuclear alliance, it will continue as a nuclear alliance. I do worry about NATO's capabilities. Right now, the only real NATO nuclear weapons are the US B-61 gravity bombs in Europe. And if you look at the most likely conflict zones and developments in Russian air defenses, I think real questions about whether dual capable aircraft with gravity bombs could penetrate. And so I think it would be worth thinking about what is the future of the NATO alliance nuclear deterrent look like? Do we need some kind of standoff capabilities, something like a nuclear JASM in addition to or as a replacement for the gravity bombs, I think could strengthen NATO as a nuclear alliance.
And in regards to missile defense in the Asia Pacific, and I think the question was specifically about, does that cause an arms race with China? And the short answer is no, it just doesn't. China has been building up missiles well before the US ever started cooperating with missile defense, either with Japan with the SM-3 or South Korea with the THAAD battery there. I think one of the defining issues in the missile defense, especially regional missile defense realm, is what do we do with Guam? Guam is going to be one of the most important assets we have, just in terms of landmass and in terms of latent capability of the things that it can supply and things that can fly off of it, land on it. How we defend Guam, especially against a Chinese missile arsenal that's growing and can essentially attack from 360 degrees all around Guam. That's going to be extremely important. And my personal opinion is we should really heavily invest in missile defense for Guam. We have some technologies that are coming online that are good enough to do that. And the Chinese need to know that they are going to have to go really big in order to take down any part of Guam, which I think will increase deterrence.
Let me finish by saying that I want to thank you, Dr. Kroenig and Matt Costlow. Wonderful presentations. You covered the waterfront. And I also want to make a note that next Monday, May 3rd, which is we have a Space Power Forum with Major General Deanna Burt, who is commander of the Combined Force Space Component Command with the U.S. Space Force. And this will be the third time she's spoken with us. The first time she spoke to us was as a colonel. So the lesson here is come speak in our forum and you'll get promoted. So with that, I hope those of you listening will join us with that. I want to thank our participants for your questions. I want to thank, we had about 85 people join us today. Again, Matt Costlow, thank you for that. And thank you for your ICBM paper that recently was published. And Dr. Kroenig, you continue to do great work. And I thank you for coming and joining us. I want to thank particularly Camilla Gunziger, who helps me put these on. She's the guts of these presentations in terms of particularly the logistics and scheduling and so forth. I want to thank you, Camilla, for that. Thank Mitchell Insitute for hosting this as well. And again, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Dr. Kroenig, for this, and thank our participants. And we will see you soon at another one of these forums. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, Peter. Great event.
Take care.